This problem ends up being more of a logic problem, kind of like a Sudoku. Let's take a look at a larger version of this grid. Let's use logic to try and fill in more of these cells. We know that each of the 5 columns is going to need a 5 in it. Let's look at the first column. The first column starts with a 1 and then a 2, and then 3 blanks. We know that the 5 can't be in either of the bottom 2 blanks because there's already 5s in the bottom 2 rows. That means that the 5 in the first column has to be in the 3rd row. So we'll write it there. Similarly, we know that the first row needs to have a 5, but it can't go in the 4th or 5th column because those columns already have 5s, so we know that we're going to need a 5 in the middle of the top row. At this point, every column except the second column and every row except the second row have a 5 in them, so the last 5 has to go right here in the second row and the second column. So we've got all our 5s in. I want to focus on 2s next. The first 2 rows each have a 2 in them. We know that each of the other rows needs to have a 2, and specifically that last row is going to need to have a 2 in it. But it can't be in either of the first 2 columns because those columns already have 2s. That means it's going to have to be in the 3rd column. So we're going to have a 2 right there. And using that same logic, we're going to have a 2 above the 5 in the last column. And using the same logic that we did with the 5s, we know that this last 2 is going to have to go in the 4th row and the 4th column right there. Now let's look at the last row. It's got a 2, a 5, and a 4 in it, so we're also going to need a 1 and a 3. But the 1 can't go in the first cell because that column already has a 1, so the 1 has to go in the second cell, and then that first cell has to end up being a 3. We can use the same logic in the last column to see that those cells are going to have to be 3 and 1 respectively. Now if we look in the top row, the only number we're missing is 4. The same is true with the first column, so we can fill those in as 4s. Next, I want to look at the 4th row. We've got a 4, a 2, and a 5 there. That means that the other 2 numbers have to be 1 and 3. But it's got to be the 3 first and then the 1 second, because there's already a 1 in that column, so it forces it to be a 3. So we've got a 3 and a 1 there, and we can use similar logic if we end up looking at the 4th column. We know that we have everything except a 1 and a 3, but we can't put a 1 next to the other one, so that's got to be a 3, and then there's going to be a 1 beneath that. Now at this point we're ready for the final answer because they ask us to find the entry in row 3, column 4, and if we go down to row 3 and column 4, we end up with 1, and that's answer choice A. But if we want, we can still fill in the rest of the grid using logic. We know that the missing number in row 2 has to be a 4 because it's the only number not in row 2. Similarly, we know the missing number in column 2 has to be a 4, and that leaves the missing number in the very middle to be 3.